It started like any other Tuesday morning. The school hallways echoed with locker doors slamming shut, sneakers squeaking across the tiled floors, and the usual chatter of kids complaining about homework or lunch. But something different was brewing that day, something no one could have possibly seen coming. And it all began when a quiet, 12-year-old girl with a backpack too big for her shoulders walked into her art class with a drawing that would stop her teacher cold in her tracks. At first glance, it looked like just another piece of a child's imagination. But 30 seconds later, the teacher wasn't smiling. Her hands were trembling. Within the hour, the police were walking through the school doors, demanding answers. And now you want to know why. You're wondering, what could possibly be so disturbing about a kid's drawing that would make an art teacher call the police? I promise you, by the end of this video, you're going to get that answer. And trust me, it's not what you're expecting. But before we go there, I need you to stay with me. This isn't just some headline or clickbait. This is real. This is about a girl whose silence hid something chilling. This story unravels slowly, one detail at a time, because the truth was never on the surface. It was buried, tucked away in strokes of crayon and pencil lines that told a story no one wanted to believe. And yet, when the drawing was finally understood, it changed everything. You see, this isn't just about a strange piece of art. It's about what happens when adults ignore the quiet signs, when kids are seen but not truly seen, and when trauma finds its way to paper because a child doesn't have the words to explain it out loud. Maybe you're a parent watching this, wondering if you'd recognize the signs in your own child. Or maybe you're a teacher, a student, or just someone who believes kids sometimes draw weird things for fun. But this time, it wasn't just weird. It was a cry for help that had gone unnoticed for months, maybe even years. Let me ask you something. Have you ever looked at a child's drawing and wondered what they were really trying to say? Not the surface-level stuff, not the stick figures and sunshine, but the things that lurk underneath. The shadows they try to color in black and red, the things they scribble when they think no one's watching? That's where this story begins. In a drawing, one that looked innocent at first. But when the teacher leaned in to take a closer look, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just the imagery that haunted her. It was the message. It was the detail. It was what was missing. And the moment she pieced it together, she made a decision that would change the girl's life forever. She picked up the phone and called the police. Now, I want you to really picture this. A middle school classroom. Paint stains on the floor. Posters of Van Gogh and Picasso on the walls. Kids chatting, cutting construction paper, laughing, doodling. And in the corner, a girl named Ellie sitting at her desk, barely saying a word. She wasn't the kind to cause trouble. In fact, most of her teachers described her as polite, quiet, keeps to herself. But that day, she brought in something she said she worked on all weekend. Her art teacher, Mrs. Collins, encouraged creativity. She was the kind of teacher who always said, "There's no wrong way to make art." But when she saw what Ellie had drawn, for the first time in 20 years of teaching, she froze. She knew, deep in her gut, this wasn't just art. This was something else. And here's where it gets even more unsettling. Because as Mrs. Collins tried to gently ask Ellie about the drawing, what it meant, who the people were, why the house had no windows, Ellie just stared at her. Not scared. Not angry. Just blank. Like she didn't even understand the questions. That's when Mrs. Collins noticed something even more disturbing. The names written along the edge of the page. Names she recognized. Names that shouldn't be there. Names of people who had no business appearing in a child's drawing unless something was terribly, terribly wrong. That's the moment this story turned from odd to urgent. It wasn't just the content of the drawing, it was the connections. Something was off. And once the school counselor got involved, things spiraled quickly. Phone calls were made. The principal was pulled out of a meeting. And before long, 2 uniformed officers were standing outside the classroom door, asking to speak with Ellie. The rest of the class didn't understand what was going on. They thought maybe she was in trouble for something minor. But they didn't see what the adults saw. They didn't feel the chill in the air when that drawing was passed around. They didn't know that a missing person case from 3 towns over was about to collide with a sleepy suburban art class in the most unexpected way. I'm telling you this because I need you to stay with me. This story is going to take turns you won't see coming. What started as a typical school day ended with a police report, a protective services investigation, and questions that, even now, no one can fully answer. This is the kind of story that makes you second-guess everything you thought you knew about the people around you. It makes you wonder how many quiet kids are walking through school hallways every day, holding on to secrets too heavy for their age. But listen, I want to be clear, this isn't about blaming the parents. It's not about blaming the teacher. This is bigger than that. It's about the systems we trust to protect children. It's about how trauma hides in plain sight. And it's about how a single drawing, one piece of paper, held the key to unraveling a story that had gone ignored for far too long. We're going to talk about Ellie. We're going to talk about her family. We're going to talk about the moment the police opened her sketchbook and realized they were staring at evidence that could crack open an old, unsolved case. But right now, I need you to lock in. Don't scroll. Don't skip. What's coming next will shift the way you think about kids, about trust, and about how sometimes it's the quiet ones who are carrying the heaviest stories. Because just when you think you've figured out what the drawing meant, just when you think you know who Ellie really is, there's one final clue buried in the sketch that no one, not even the cops, noticed at first. And when that detail is revealed, the entire story explodes. Ellie Hadler wasn't the kind of kid anyone paid much attention to. Not in a bad way. She wasn't a troublemaker. She didn't act out. She didn't push back against authority. She was just quiet. The kind of girl who blended into the background, who never raised her hand unless directly called on, and who always seemed to be scribbling something in her sketchbook, even when she thought no one was watching. If you asked around, you'd hear the same thing over and over. She was polite, respectful, a little withdrawn maybe, but overall just your typical middle school kid. Her classmates didn't really know her. Even her teachers, as much as they cared, couldn't quite say what made her tick. And that, in hindsight, might have been the first clue that no one really knew her at all. Over the past few weeks, subtle things about Ellie had begun to shift. Nothing dramatic, nothing you could easily put your finger on, but the kind of changes that only reveal their importance after the fact. Her grades had started slipping just a little at first. A missed homework assignment here, a forgotten project there. She used to be one of those always prepared students, the kind who'd never forget a permission slip or a due date. Lately, though, it was different. She came to school with dark circles under her eyes. Her clothes looked a little more wrinkled, like she'd pulled them from the bottom of a laundry basket. She stopped bringing lunch from home and started hanging around the free lunch line in the cafeteria. Still, none of it felt serious enough to raise alarms. Kids go through phases. Middle school is hard. Everyone assumed she was just having a rough patch. But there were things about Ellie that didn't quite fit the usual narrative. She rarely talked about home. When other kids chatted about their parents or siblings or weekend plans, she stayed quiet. When teachers asked about her family life, nothing intrusive, just polite questions, she'd deflect with vague answers or change the subject. And then there were the drawings. Ellie had always been talented, in that raw, untrained way some kids are. Her sketchbook was full of vivid imagery, fantastical creatures, surreal landscapes, sometimes portraits that were a little too detailed for a girl her age. But in the last few weeks, her art had taken a darker turn. Gone were the bright colors and whimsical doodles. In their place were gray smudges, shadowy figures, houses without doors, windows that looked like eyes, and children drawn with no mouths. It wasn't just a style shift. It felt intentional. And for those who really looked, it felt like a message. At school, Ellie kept mostly to herself. She didn't sit with anyone at lunch and never joined after-school clubs. The only person she ever spent any real time with was a boy named Mason, a wiry kid with a nervous laugh and a backpack that seemed too heavy for his frame. Mason had been in and out of the school counseling office a few times for reasons no one ever really talked about. Rumors floated around, of course they always do. Some kids said he lived with his grandmother because his parents were gone. Others whispered about police visits and strange adults showing up at his house late at night. Mason and Ellie weren't exactly best friends, but they had that quiet understanding some kids share when they recognize something familiar in each other's silences. They sat together in class, sometimes. They'd trade snacks without speaking. But even Mason didn't know about the drawing. Not until it was too late. Then there was Ellie's neighbor, Mrs. Franklin, an older woman who lived alone across the street and occasionally offered to drive Ellie to school if the weather was bad. She described Ellie as sweet and well-mannered, but also mentioned something odd during a casual phone call with another parent. She said that for the past month, she'd noticed Ellie standing outside her house late at night, just standing, not moving, sometimes barefoot, staring across the road at nothing in particular. When she'd ask if she was okay, Ellie would just smile and say she couldn't sleep. Mrs. Franklin never thought to report it. What was there to report? A kid with insomnia? But in the wake of what happened at school, those moments suddenly felt much heavier. And when the police eventually came knocking, Mrs. Franklin found herself wishing she'd paid closer attention. The school resource officer, Officer Ramirez, was one of the first to respond after Mrs. Collins called. He took one look at the drawing and immediately requested a second opinion from the local precinct. It wasn't just what was drawn, it was how it was drawn. The angles. The way certain names were carefully hidden behind bricks in the background. One name in particular, scratched faintly behind the outline of a tree, matched a missing child report from nearly 2 years ago. A girl who disappeared from a nearby town under murky circumstances. Her case had gone cold, with no leads, no suspects, and no closure. Until now. Until Ellie's drawing. But here's where things start to get even stranger. When police visited Ellie's home that afternoon, they found her mother, Jennifer Hadeler, visibly shaken, confused, and almost frantic. She claimed she had no idea Ellie had drawn anything like that. She said everything at home was fine, but her tone wavered, and her eyes darted like someone searching for the right version of the truth. The house was tidy but cold. Not in a physical sense, but emotionally. No pictures of family on the walls. No signs of warmth. Just white paint, clean counters, and an eerie stillness that made the officers uneasy. Jennifer told them Ellie's father wasn't around anymore, that he had walked out years ago and hadn't been in touch since. She said she worked late shifts at the hospital and didn't always have time to check Ellie's homework or her artwork. But something about her story didn't sit right. Neighbors described frequent visitors to the house, men they didn't recognize, cars with out-of-state plates, loud arguments late at night that stopped just as quickly as they started. There were rumors, but nothing confirmed. And so far, there was no clear line between those visitors and the names in Ellie's drawing. But the deeper the officers looked, the more the lines started to blur. And while all of this was unraveling, questions piling up, red flags waving in every direction, Ellie wasn't saying a word. Not to her teachers. Not to her mother. Not even to the detective assigned to her case. She sat in the school counselor's office with her knees pulled to her chest, silent, like the words were locked somewhere she couldn't reach. But she kept her sketchbook close, clutched to her side like it held something precious. Or something dangerous. At this point, everyone wanted answers. Was Ellie trying to confess to something? Was she a witness to something horrible? Was her drawing a code, a map, a memory? Was it a warning? And if so, to whom? Her classmates, when questioned, didn't have much to offer. Most said she kept herself. A few mentioned seeing bruises on her arms a few months ago, but assumed she was just clumsy. No one really knew her. And in that vacuum of understanding, the speculation grew. And then came a twist no one could have anticipated. Mason disappeared. The same Mason who always walked Ellie home, who had once gotten detention for punching a kid that called her creepy, who had been absent the day the drawing was turned in. Gone. No goodbye. No call. No clue. Now the question wasn't just, what did Ellie draw? It became, where is Mason? And more urgently, what did Ellie know that she wasn't saying? The day after Mason's disappearance, the entire atmosphere at school shifted. It wasn't just the students who were on edge, it was the staff, too. Whispers floated through the hallways like smoke, too vague to grab, but heavy enough to choke. Teachers avoided eye contact, students clung to their phones for updates, and every conversation seemed to circle back to one thing. What did Ellie know? But she still hadn't spoken. Not a single word. Not to the school counselor. Not to the officer. not even when her mother showed up demanding answers. And then, as if the situation wasn't already spiraling fast enough, the sketchbook vanished. The very item that had started this entire storm, gone. No trace. One minute it was in Officer Ramirez's custody, logged into the school's evidence locker for safekeeping, and the next, the locker was empty. No forced entry, no footage of someone taking it, just a clean break in the chain of evidence like it had never existed. The disappearance of the sketchbook set off a firestorm behind the scenes. Ramirez was pulled off the case temporarily, pending an internal review. School officials clammed up. The principal issued a vague, PR-approved statement about student privacy and ongoing investigations that only fueled more speculation. Meanwhile, Ellie was pulled from her regular classes and placed on temporary leave. Her mother withdrew her from art altogether, claiming the school had traumatized her child enough. But Jennifer Hadler wasn't fooling everyone. Some of the teachers, especially Mrs. Collins, had started to suspect there was more going on at home than Jennifer was willing to admit. One night, Mrs. Collins received an unmarked envelope in her school mailbox. No return address. No note. Inside was a photo, grainy, time-stamped 3 years ago, of Ellie standing in front of what looked like a boarded-up building. In the background was Mason, and next to him, an older man no one recognized. The building had long since been torn down, but the timestamp and location matched an old community center that had been shut down abruptly after reports of structural concerns. Nothing about the photo made sense. Why had it been sent to her? And more importantly, why now? Digging deeper only made things worse. Mrs. Collins tried contacting the precinct to share the photo, but they dismissed her call, telling her to route all evidence through the school board. But when she brought it up to the school board, they said it was outside their jurisdiction. It was like every door she knocked on slammed shut before she could even explain. That night, her car alarm went off 3 times. The next morning, all 4 of her tires had been slashed. She didn't file a report. She just stopped asking questions. And she wasn't the only one feeling the pressure. One of the janitors, an older man named Leo, who had previously mentioned seeing someone unfamiliar wandering the hallways after hours, suddenly quit his job. No notice. No forwarding contact. Just gone. And the hallway camera he claimed had footage of that person? Wiped clean, archived data mysteriously corrupted in a server glitch. As more pieces of the puzzle went missing or were erased, those who were trying to make sense of it all began to pull back. Except one. Ellie. Still silent, still under the radar, but now with a look in her eyes that was different, calculated, cautious, and maybe even scared. She wasn't just retreating into herself. She was watching, listening. She started sketching again, but not in public. Not in class. In secret. On scraps of paper she folded into tiny squares and stuffed into the lining of her backpack. And late one afternoon, a substitute teacher named Mr. Arlo, who'd been filling in for social studies, caught her carefully sliding one of those notes into a library book before checking it in. Most subs wouldn't have thought much of it, but Mr. Arlo wasn't new to this kind of behavior. He used to teach in a district with a history of trafficking cases. Real, serious ones that were swept under the rug by local authorities. When he opened the book after school, he found a drawing that looked like a crude map. Street signs, dotted lines, and in the middle, a single word scratched in black ink. Basement. The location wasn't obvious, but something about the layout triggered a memory. Years ago, there had been a news story about an abandoned residence outside town, a farmhouse that had been converted into a so-called group home before it was shut down due to code violations. It wasn't far from the old community center. The news story was buried deep online, and almost no one remembered it anymore. But when Mr. Arlo tried to bring the drawing to the police, he was told not to involve himself. When he asked who is currently assigned to Ellie's case, the officer simply said, "There's nothing open. Everything's been closed."
How could that be?
A child disappears, a disturbing drawing links to a cold case, and now suddenly all investigations are marked closed. Mr. Arlo didn't buy it. But he also realized something far more chilling. Someone didn't want the truth to come out. And whoever it was had reach. That night, as he was leaving school, He noticed a black SUV idling near the faculty lot. No plates. Tinted windows. He turned toward it, but it drove off slowly, no headlights. When he got home, his power was out, even though every other house on the block was lit up. And his front door was unlocked. He was sure he'd locked it. He checked every room. Nothing missing. But a single sheet of paper was left on his kitchen table. A photocopy. Ellie's map. Except this one had a red X drawn over it. And a message written in block letters underneath. Let it go. But not everyone was ready to back down. Mason's grandmother had come forward recently, claiming she received a voicemail in the early morning hours. Static, faint breathing, and in the final few seconds, a soft voice whispering, "Don't forget the window." No one could verify the number. It was marked untraceable by the phone company. And when they tried to pull her call records, the voicemail wasn't there. Just gone. Now, more questions than answers remain. Who is behind the disappearance of a sketchbook? Why is Ellie's art tied to locations long forgotten by authorities? What happened at that old community center? Why are the people trying to help being silenced? And most chilling of all, what's in the basement Ellie drew? She hasn't said a word. But her next drawing? That one will change everything. 3 days after the photocopy with the red X appeared on Mr. Arlo's kitchen table, another strange event pulled the curtain back on a deeper, even darker layer of the mystery, one that hinted Ellie might not be the only child trying to communicate through drawings. Across town, in a neighborhood so ordinary it could have been part of a movie set, a middle school counselor named Dina Morales received a late-night email from an anonymous address. There was no subject line, no message body, just a single image attachment, low resolution, black and white, and heavily pixelated. At first, she thought it was some kind of glitch or spam, until she zoomed in and recognized something hauntingly familiar, a drawing of a girl standing in front of a window, holding what appeared to be a broken watch. But it wasn't the image itself that made her stomach drop. It was the signature at the bottom corner, a faint scribble of a name, Ellie H. And Ellie H. wasn't one of her students. Dina didn't understand why she'd received this. She didn't work at Ellie's school. She'd never met the girl. But years ago, she'd worked at a local foster home that had since closed down. She kept records, notes, files, small pieces of information that, at the time, hadn't seemed relevant. But now, as she searched through her archived case files and flipped through the fading documents, a single connection emerged. Ellie's name was never listed in the official roster of the children who stayed there, but a younger child named Eliana Hadler appeared in a file dated 6 years ago, flagged as placed temporarily pending investigation. What that investigation was, the file didn't say. The paperwork abruptly ended without follow-up. It was like the child had appeared on paper, then vanished. Something about the timing gnawed at Dina. She remembered there had been another child who stayed at the home briefly around that time, a boy named Mason. But not the same Mason currently missing. This boy would have been older now, probably a senior in high school, except no school in the area had a record of him graduating. It was as if both kids had existed in the margins, touching the system without ever truly being inside it. That night, shaken and unable to sleep, Dina called the only person she still trusted from those days, Marcus Wynn, a former caseworker who'd left Child Protective Services after blowing the whistle on a string of clerical errors that covered up missing children reports. Marcus had been blackballed professionally, pushed out of the system, and eventually ended up working night security at a freight yard. But his memory was sharp, and when Dina mentioned the name Hadler, he immediately tensed up. "You're not supposed to say that name," he said. There were whispers. The Hadler file wasn't just about a bad home situation. It had layers, sealed documents, higher-ups pushing for silence. The mother was connected to someone. Big money. She pulled her daughter out of one group home overnight, without explanation, and the case was locked the next day. "You're opening something you don't want to open, Dina." But Dina was already in too deep. She searched the digital archive for mentions of the group home's final inspection report. Most files came up clean, but one line in a redacted form caught her attention. Witness statement suggests unauthorized visitors used the facility basement after hours, Records indicate one adult male and 2 minors were observed during blackout periods. No names, no charges, no follow-up, but the phrase "basement after hours" echoed the words scrawled in Ellie's hidden drawing. Things escalated quickly after that. The next morning, Dina discovered her laptop wiped clean. Every file she'd pulled the night before gone. Even her backups on the cloud had been disabled. A message had been left on her screen in the form of a system alert that wasn't actually from her operating system. It simply said, "Watch the window." Dina didn't know what it meant until that night, when she noticed a shadow move behind the curtains of her second-floor bedroom. No footprints, no sound. Just the cold awareness that she wasn't alone. Back at the school, Ellie returned quietly after a week away. Her mother, Jennifer, insisted it was time to move on, to stop feeding the fantasy, but Ellie came back changed. Quieter, but also sharper. She no longer looked confused or traumatized. She looked guarded. Mrs. Collins saw it immediately. Something had shifted inside Ellie, and it wasn't just fear. It was calculation, as if she knew something no one else did. When asked about her sketchbook, she didn't even blink. She simply said, "That wasn't the real one," which sent a shockwave through Mrs. Collins. What did she mean, the real one? Around this same time, another twist threw everything into chaos. A freshman student named Caleb, an introverted kid who often kept to himself and had no known ties to Ellie, was caught trying to set fire to a stack of art supplies in the back of the classroom. When questioned, all he said was, "They told me to." Authorities wrote it off as attention-seeking behavior, but Mrs. Collins wasn't convinced. Not when they discovered that Caleb had received an anonymous package the day before, delivered to the school under the name E. Hadler. Inside were charcoal pencils, a paintbrush coated in dry red pigment, and a note that read, "Finish what she started." The handwriting wasn't Ellie's. It didn't match Jennifer's. In fact, it didn't match any sample in the school's database. It was clean, adult, and chillingly deliberate. The realization started to creep in that someone, maybe more than one person, was manipulating these kids from the shadows. Drawing them in. Pushing them towards something none of the adults could understand. And now, with both a missing sketchbook and a possibly fake version, a mysterious connection between former group homes, and threats being sent to seemingly random people connected to Ellie, the idea that this was just a coincidence began to collapse. Who was watching through that window? Who left the X over Ellie's map, and why? And what happened in that basement years ago that is suddenly being unearthed now, drawing not just Ellie but others into its gravity? The more they tried to piece things together, the more disjointed the picture became, as if the truth itself was fragmented, only available to those who knew where to look or who to fear. But the biggest twist? That was still waiting in the wings. And it was about to change everything they thought they knew. It was just past 11 p.m. when Mrs. Collins, still shaken from the recent events and unable to sleep, decided to review the school's hallway surveillance footage again. She had already gone over the recordings twice earlier that week, but something about the timeline nagged at her. The hours just after Caleb tried to torch the art room supplies. As the footage skipped through frame by frame, her eyes caught something she hadn't noticed before. A figure, tall, clad in black, standing just outside the rear stairwell leading to the sub-basement level, an area that had been locked for years. The figure never entered any classroom, never interacted with any students or staff, but simply stood there unmoving for over 4 minutes before slowly disappearing into the shadows. The timestamp? 43 minutes before Caleb received the anonymous package. Her heart began to race. There had never been a scheduled maintenance crew on that day. No janitorial check-ins. That figure had no business being there. And even stranger, no one else appeared to notice him. When she reported the footage to the school resource officer, the video had already been corrupted. The timestamp was gone. The figure was no longer visible. It was as though she had hallucinated the entire event, but she hadn't. She remembered every detail. The posture, the stillness, the slow turn of the head toward the camera. It had been real. And now it was gone. Back at home, Ellie started acting even stranger. She began to avoid mirrors and refused to sleep with the lights off. Her room was no longer just untidy. It looked like a war zone of shredded paper, broken pencils, and crumpled sketches scattered across the floor. Her mother, Jennifer, tried to downplay it, calling it artistic frustration, but Mrs. Collins knew better. Something was unraveling inside the girl. One day, after school, Ellie waited until she and Mrs. Collins were alone and whispered, "I think he's back." When pressed, she wouldn't say who he was. She just pointed toward the school's West Wing windows and said, "He watches me when you don't." Mrs. Collins started noticing the signs herself. A black SUV parked at odd hours outside her house. The feeling of being watched, especially near dusk. Her phone began to behave strangely. Calls dropped without warning, her location services toggled off and on by themselves, and one night, she received a single-word text from an unknown number, "Stop." No punctuation, no sender ID. Just stop. The tension reached a breaking point when Jennifer Hadler failed to pick up Ellie from school one afternoon. It was completely out of character. Jennifer had never missed a pickup, not even once. After 30 minutes of waiting, the school called her emergency contacts, but none were reachable. A search was made. Calls were placed to neighbors. Nothing. By early evening, law enforcement conducted a wellness check at the Hadler residence. The front door was locked. The house was empty. No signs of forced entry. No indication of a struggle. Jennifer Hadler had vanished, leaving behind a dinner half prepared on the stove, a glass of wine untouched, and Ellie's baby photo, newly torn, sitting face down on the kitchen counter. Authorities started a missing persons investigation, but Mrs. Collins sensed a different energy in the way the officers moved through the home. Tense, hesitant, as if they already knew this wasn't going to be a standard case. As she stood outside, clutching Ellie's hand, the girls said something that chilled her to the bone. "She thought they forgot about us, but they didn't. They remember everything. And they're angry." That night, unable to sleep, Mrs. Collins pulled out every old student file she could find that even remotely connected to Ellie's transfer. There wasn't much, but a single note written in pen on the back of a transcript stood out. Custodial order reassigned due to incident at prior institution. Subject deemed emotionally displaced, non-reactive, requires specialized observation. There was no signature, no institution name, just a paper trail that ended in mid-sentence. When she tried to cross-reference it with school records, the document had been removed from the system entirely. She wasn't supposed to have this page. Somehow, it had slipped through. Later that same week, a parent of another student, Mrs. Jensen, whose son often sat near Ellie in class, called in a panic. Her son, Ryan, had woken up crying in the middle of the night after drawing a disturbing picture in his sleep. He didn't remember making it. The drawing showed a classroom, identical to Mrs. Collins's room, but with red marks slashed across the blackboard and every window covered in dark ink. At the center of the sketch was Ellie, drawn with hollow eyes, holding a pencil that bled into the page. Ryan had never drawn anything like that before. He didn't even like art. Now others were starting to feel it too. A heavy, creeping weight that things weren't just off, they were dangerous. Something bigger was unraveling behind the scenes, something too calculated to be a coincidence. Mrs. Collins began to fear that the threat wasn't just to Ellie anymore. It was spreading, infecting other students, other families. And with Jennifer gone and no credible leads to her whereabouts, the safety net was gone. Mrs. Collins started double-bolting her doors at night. She installed motion sensors, changed her Wi-Fi passwords, and stopped answering private number calls. But the fear remained, like static in her chest that wouldn't fade. Who was the man in the surveillance footage? Why were children drawing images they couldn't explain? Who was sending the anonymous packages? And why did it feel like everything was tied to a past that someone, somewhere, was trying very hard to erase? Yet the most terrifying realization came not from any clue, but from a subtle shift in Ellie herself. She no longer seemed like a scared child trying to make sense of her drawings. Now, it was almost as if she understood something dark, something permanent. And one night, before heading home, she looked directly at Mrs. Collins and said, "They'll come for you too." Once you start seeing it, they always do. Mrs. Collins wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, as trauma, as a child echoing fear. But deep down, she knew Ellie wasn't guessing. She was warning her. And in that moment, a knock echoed at the classroom door. After hours, long after the school had emptied out. No one was supposed to be there. And that's when the lights cut out. The knock at the classroom door had barely faded when the lights went out completely, plunging the room into a darkness so thick it felt suffocating. Mrs. Collins froze, her breath catching in her throat as her hand instinctively reached for her phone, only to find it dead, completely drained, even though it had been nearly at full charge just minutes earlier. Ellie didn't move. She just stood by the window, her silhouette outlined faintly by the glow of the emergency lights from the hallway. "He's not here for me," she whispered. "He's here for you now." That sentence clung to the air like frost, and Mrs. Collins didn't know if the chill running through her spine was from fear or realization. Moments later, a voice came through the intercom system, one that hadn't been used in over a decade, deep, calm, and unfamiliar. It simply said, "She remembers too much." Then silence. And just like that, the lights blinked back on. Mrs. Collins rushed to the door, throwing it open to the empty hallway beyond. No footsteps, no intruder, no trace of anyone having been there. But the real twist wouldn't come until the following morning, when a name surfaced from Ellie's old transcripts, one that had never appeared before, even in her emergency contacts. It was signed on the back of a document now mysteriously reinserted into the school's digital records, Dr. Harold A. Collins, guardian, by legal override. It stopped Mrs. Collins cold. That was her father's name. But he had died nearly 20 years ago, long before Ellie was even born. Convinced this had to be a mistake, she called her older sister in Pennsylvania, hoping to find some old family documents to disprove what she was seeing. But her sister hesitated, then admitted something Mrs. Collins had never been told. Their father had been involved in a highly confidential psychological program during the 1990s, working with the Department of Defense on children exhibiting anomalous perceptual abilities. The program was shut down after several unexplainable incidents, one of which allegedly involved a young girl who could draw premonitions with disturbing accuracy. The official story claimed she died during a routine psychological evaluation. But the timeline didn't line up, because the name of that girl, buried deep in government files, was Alara Hadley. Alara Hadley, Ellie Hadler. The names weren't identical, but close enough to raise suspicion. And that's when it hit her. Ellie wasn't just another transfer student. She had been part of something buried, hidden, and later reborn under a new identity. The reason she could draw things that hadn't happened yet, the reason she could see the man no one else could, wasn't coincidence. It was legacy. And her connection to Mrs. Collins wasn't accidental either. If her father had overseen the original program, then Ellie showing up at her school wasn't fate. It was design. Mrs. Collins scrambled through old yearbooks, personnel records, anything that might prove her father's connection to these events. That's when she found it. A photograph taken during a psychology department conference in 1997, back when she was in high school. Her father stood beside a woman labeled Dr. Evelyn Hadley, Neurodevelopmental Research Division. Ellie's mother, Jennifer Hadler, had used her middle name. They'd changed their identities. They had been hiding. But hiding from what? And then came the biggest shock of all. An envelope, unmarked, slid under her classroom door during recess. Inside was a torn photograph of Ellie standing beside another child. Another girl, same age, identical in every feature. A twin. On the back, written in that same blocky handwriting she had seen on the corrupted surveillance timestamp, were the words, "One draws. One remembers. One forgets." The twist unraveled everything. Ellie wasn't alone. And more importantly, the one they were protecting might not be her. The entire mystery, the drawings, the strange behaviors, the vanishing files, could have been a misdirection. A decoy. Mrs. Collins realized she had been following the wrong thread all along, chasing clues around Ellie when the real story might have been with a sister no one ever mentioned. A sister who, if still alive, could be the key to understanding not just the danger, but the entire program that had seemingly disappeared decades ago. Now the question wasn't just who Ellie really was. It was who her sister might be, and why someone had gone to such terrifying lengths to erase her existence. The air was colder than usual that morning, not because of the weather, but because of the weight Mrs. Collins carried as she walked into school. Every hallway, every doorframe, every student's face felt different now, like the ground beneath her had shifted, and no one else had noticed. The photograph of the twin girls hadn't left her mind. She'd kept it hidden deep in her coat pocket, checking every so often to make sure it was still there, as if it might vanish like everything else had. That morning, she made a decision she never thought she would. She had to confront the one person who had always stood beside her through everything, her mother. The woman who'd raised her, who'd cried with her when her father passed, who'd helped her become the teacher she was today. If her father had been involved in that secret government program, and Ellie was somehow a product of it, then surely her mother must have known something. She had to. She waited until evening, driving out to her mother's old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The sky was heavy with clouds, casting long shadows over the fields. When she arrived, her mother was already on the porch with a cup of coffee in hand, as if she'd been expecting her. That unsettled her more than anything. Without saying a word, she handed over the photograph. Her mother stared at it for a long time, then finally sighed, deep and tired, like someone who'd been holding in a truth for far too long. "You were never supposed to see this," she said softly. "I warned him not to involve you." Those words stung. Not because they were cold, but because they were spoken with regret. Her mother explained that yes, her father had worked with children who exhibited rare neural patterns, abilities they couldn't fully understand. Some called it clairvoyance. Others called it a glitch in brain chemistry. Whatever it was, the government saw potential. But things spiraled quickly. The program lost control when two sisters showed signs of neural synchronization. What one saw, the other could draw. What one experienced, the other could forget. They were meant to be separated, their memories split to protect them. But there was a breach. Someone inside the program had tried to smuggle one of the girls out, to save her from what was coming. That someone was her father. And now, decades later, it seemed like history was repeating itself. But the real shock wasn't the program or even the twins.
It was what her mother said next.
"You were born before the program ended, Amanda. I never told you this, but you spent the first few years of your life inside those walls, in that facility. They tested you too." Mrs. Collins could barely breathe. "That's why your memory's full of holes. Why certain years just feel foggy. You were part of it, Amanda. Maybe not like them, but enough that they kept watching you long after your father died." Suddenly, everything clicked. The dreams. The flashes of déjà vu. The strange connection she felt with Ellie from the moment they met. It wasn't just empathy, it was memory. But that revelation came at a cost. Her mother warned her that if she kept digging, she'd trigger the same fail-safes her father had once warned about. Fail-safes designed to erase not just evidence, but people. She was given a choice: leave it alone and keep her life, or keep pursuing the truth and risk becoming part of the cover-up that had buried so many before her. It wasn't just her career on the line now, it was her sanity, her identity, even her freedom. But how could she turn away? If she'd once been part of this, unknowingly or not, didn't she owe it to Ellie and whoever her sister was, to find out what really happened? Back at the school, things were unraveling fast. Ellie had stopped speaking altogether. She wouldn't draw, wouldn't write. Just stared out the window, whispering under her breath. When asked what she was saying, she'd respond with only one phrase: "She's waking up." And then, in the middle of the day, Mrs. Collins received a message from the main office. A girl had just arrived at the school entrance claiming to be a transfer student. No records. No parents. Just a name written in messy ink on a crumpled registration form: Eva Hadley. The impossible had happened. The twin was here. And now Mrs. Collins stood on the edge of two terrifying possibilities. Either she'd been manipulated into a delusion so convincing it felt real, or reality itself had just cracked open, revealing a truth far darker and more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. She had to choose. Turn this over to authorities who might already be compromised, or face it alone and risk everything. As she walked toward the school entrance, her heart pounding with every step, she knew one thing with painful clarity. There was no going back. And the next door she opened might change, not only her life, but every truth she thought she understood about it. The storm that had been building for days finally broke, not in the sky, but in the halls of Lincoln Middle School, where quiet whispers had turned into frantic calls, and lingering glances between faculty had hardened into something colder. Mrs. Collins barely recognized the world around her anymore. What had started with one disturbing drawing had spiraled into something monstrous. And now, as she sat inside the dim, windowless office of the assistant superintendent, a man she'd worked alongside for nearly 8 years, she realized the real enemy wasn't hidden in the shadows. He was sitting directly across from her. Mr. Lane had always seemed harmless, mild-mannered, bookish, the kind of administrator who focused more on standardized testing than hallway fights. But now, something in his demeanor had shifted. His face was unreadable, and when he locked the door behind her, her stomach twisted. On his desk was a folder, thick, worn at the edges, and stamped in faded red, "Confidential. Hadley Project." Without saying a word, he opened it, revealing dozens of documents, photographs, medical charts, surveillance transcripts, all of them about Ellie. And one other girl, Amanda Collins. That's when it all shattered. He didn't speak in riddles. He didn't hide behind bureaucratic language. What he said next was clear and cold and terrifying. "You were always going to lead us back to her," he said. "You just didn't know it yet." As the words settled into her bones, everything she thought she understood about her life collapsed. He told her that after the original project was shut down, remnants of it were absorbed into a quiet, privately funded initiative, one that continued operating under the radar. Their objective wasn't to protect the girls.
It was to control them.
Test them. Weaponize what made them different. Ellie had been one of the last subjects, but she escaped before full integration. She'd been placed in a civilian environment to monitor her neurological regression. That civilian environment was Mrs. Collins' classroom. The placement hadn't been an accident, but it went even deeper. Amanda hadn't just been watched, she'd been groomed. From the moment she entered public education, her curriculum, her mentors, her career path had been carefully shaped by people like Lane. Because her connection to the Hadley twins wasn't incidental. It was intentional. They needed someone close to Ellie. Someone who could unlock the part of her mind that had been closed off by trauma. And Amanda had unknowingly done just that. Every interaction, every piece of trust she built with Ellie was part of a larger pattern of neural awakening. And now that both girls were present, Eva and Ellie, the convergence was complete. She was furious.
Betrayed. Broken.
"Why me?" she asked, voice trembling with rage. Lane smiled, not cruelly, but with something worse. Pity. "Because they trust you. And because you've already been activated once before. You just don't remember." She fled the building before the weight of what he'd said could fully crush her. She didn't have a plan. She didn't even know where to go. All she knew was that she had to find the girls before they did. But when she returned to her classroom, both Ellie and Eva were gone. No note. No witnesses. No camera footage. It was like they'd never existed. Panic clawed at her throat. The hallways echoed with silence. She ran to the art room, Ellie's safe space, and there, taped to the wall, was a new drawing. This one was different. It wasn't childlike. It was precise. Detailed.
A map.
A blueprint. Coordinates written in strange symbols that Mrs. Collins somehow understood without knowing how. And at the bottom, scrawled in messy charcoal, "You have one chance. Don't trust anyone." Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a new voicemail. She didn't recognize the number, but the voice on the recording froze her in place. It was Principal Hughes. Except, Principal Hughes had resigned months ago after his wife fell terminally ill. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the school anymore. But now his voice was low, urgent, almost panicked. "Amanda, they're watching you. They've always been watching. Ellie wasn't the only one they planted. Check the staff files." You'll see who else was involved. Don't trust Lane. Don't trust the nurse. And whatever you do, don't go home. They've already been there. Suddenly, nothing felt safe. Not her classroom. Not her home. Not her memories. Every relationship she'd relied on was now suspect. Had her entire life been part of a long-term experiment? Had every conversation, every chance encounter been orchestrated for this moment? And more importantly, why? Her breathing grew shallow as she pulled open her laptop and hacked into the staff database. The page loaded slowly, almost like something was fighting back. But then she saw it. A name listed as a visiting counselor who had only recently joined the staff. No interview. No credentials. Just a temporary clearance. The name, Dr. Owen Finch. But that wasn't the real shock. The photo next to the name was a face she knew too well. It was the man who had once treated her for night terrors when she was 6. She remembered his office, his smile, the way he'd asked questions no child should ever have to answer. And now he was back. Something deep inside her snapped. The fear, the confusion, the sense of helplessness, it all gave way to something sharper. Determination. She wasn't going to run anymore. She wasn't going to be someone else's pawn. She would follow the map, find the girls, and uncover the truth buried under decades of lies and manipulation. But the clock was ticking. Every second brought her closer to being found. And every clue she uncovered only led her deeper into a conspiracy so vast and twisted it reached far beyond her school, her town, possibly even her country. And worst of all, someone was already one step ahead. She arrived at the abandoned observatory just past midnight, her headlights slicing through the dense fog like knives. The structure loomed at the edge of a forgotten valley outside town, swallowed by woods thick with silence. It had once been a place of learning, astronomy nights for school kids, public lectures on meteor showers, but now it was something else entirely. Mrs. Collins tightened her grip on the steering wheel, heart pounding in her throat, unsure if she was walking into a trap or the final truth. The coordinates from Ellie's drawing had led her here, and despite everything screaming at her to turn back, she knew this was where it all had to end. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with mold and old dust. The observatory's massive dome was cracked, letting in cold streaks of moonlight that danced across the control panels and collapsed chairs. In the center of the room stood a figure, tall, motionless, back turned. Amanda hesitated, but then the voice rang out, calm and familiar in the most unsettling way. "You finally made it," said Dr. Owen Finch. The so-called counselor, who had been pulling strings longer than Amanda had even realized. He didn't turn around. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. The same one he used to write in when she was a child in therapy. The same one he never let anyone touch. "It's all in here," he said. "Every test. Every outcome. Every memory we erased." Amanda took a step forward, her voice low and trembling. "Where are the girls?" Finch chuckled softly, almost with admiration. "You still think this is about them. You always did. But Ellie and Eva were never the experiment. You were. You were always the constant, the variable, the one who could be shaped without knowing it. They were just the catalysts to awaken what was already inside you." He turned slowly, and for the first time, Amanda saw what he had become. Not the kindly doctor from her childhood, but someone consumed by obsession. His eyes glinted with a manic kind of purpose. She wanted to scream, to run, but then Ellie stepped out of the shadows, her expression unreadable. Behind her, Eva followed, both girls unharmed, both silent. Amanda's heart sank with confusion. Were they part of it? Had they been leading her here all along? But Ellie held up something small, metallic, blinking, and Amanda realized it was a transmitter. "He tracked you," Ellie whispered. "He needed you to bring the coordinates back here. You're not just the key. You're the lock. And he's been trying to open you." Suddenly, lights flickered on one by one, revealing a massive wall lined with screens, surveillance footage from the school, Amanda's apartment, even her childhood home. Dozens of people's faces flashed across them, Teachers, students, administrators, all connected to something larger. Project Hadley hadn't ended. It had expanded. Quietly, ruthlessly. And Amanda's entire life had been the blueprint. But then Ellie handed her a file, something she'd stolen from Finch's coat when he wasn't watching. Inside was the truth no one saw coming. Amanda had a twin, a sister born minutes after her, taken at birth, listed as deceased, but secretly raised inside the program as Subject Delta. And that sister was Eva. They hadn't just bonded over trauma. They'd bonded because their DNA called to one another. Their separation had been intentional to test the psychological effects of nurture versus manipulation. Amanda had been raised in the wild, and Eva in the lab. And now that both were together again, Finch believed he could trigger a final stage, something that would change everything they knew about memory, control, and consciousness. Amanda felt the ground tilt beneath her. Her entire identity was shattered. Her choices, her beliefs, her grief, all orchestrated. But she wasn't the same scared child anymore. She stepped forward, closer to Finch, voice steely. "You think I'm going to give you what you want, but you've already lost. Because I remember now. I remember everything." She took the notebook from his hand and dropped it into a nearby panel of exposed wires. Sparks flew as it caught fire. Finch screamed, lunging for her, but Ellie moved faster, pressing the transmitter button and sending out a blinding pulse of light that knocked Finch to his knees. The observatory groaned as hidden doors unlocked and alarms blared. External surveillance systems were collapsing under their own weight. But just when Amanda thought it was over, when Finch was cuffed by the agents Ellie had secretly called using a hidden channel in the transmitter, Amanda noticed something strange on the screens. A live feed from her childhood bedroom. The camera moved.
Zoomed.
And then a figure stepped into frame. Not Finch. Not Eva. But a woman middle-aged, with Amanda's eyes. The same eyes as Ellie and Eva. And the screen froze on her face just as the word active lit up beneath it. Amanda stared at the screen, breathless. The final twist hit harder than anything else. Her mother wasn't dead. She wasn't a victim. She was the architect. And she was still out there, watching. As the agents led Finch away and the observatory began to collapse around them, Amanda stood frozen, one question echoing louder than all the rest. How long had her own mother been playing both sides? And more terrifyingly, why was she only showing her face now? The observatory was reduced to rubble by morning, its skeletal remains cordoned off behind layers of yellow tape and half-hearted statements from government agencies that claimed structural failure and undisclosed experiments as the cause. Reporters swarmed the area, camera crews shouted over each other, and trending hashtags flooded every social platform. Hashtag Hadley Files, hashtag Memory Manipulation, hashtag Project Delta. But none of them knew the truth, not really. They didn't know what Amanda Collins had seen inside those walls, what she had destroyed to keep others from suffering the same fate. She gave no interviews, no statements. She simply returned to her quiet life in the city with Ellie and Eva, though quiet had taken on a new meaning. Every creak in the floorboards, every flicker of the hallway light, every unfamiliar face on the street now came with a shadow of doubt. The truth had changed her, not in the dramatic, heroic way movies liked to pretend, but in the deeper, quieter moments when she couldn't sleep or caught herself checking for cameras in her own home. The girls tried to resume school, but nothing was the same. Eva struggled the most, years of conditioning unraveling now that the walls were gone and choice was finally hers. Ellie was quieter, too, but resilient in her own way, always sketching the same woman in her notebook. Their mother, still out there, still a phantom hovering at the edges of their lives. Amanda had tried to burn the final page of that story, but some truths wouldn't stay buried. She'd handed over the remaining files to a journalist who promised to expose everything, and for a time, the internet buzzed with talk of covert child experiments, neural rewiring, and parental betrayal. But just as quickly as it had exploded, the story was buried under distractions, celebrity scandals, political outrage, viral TikTok dances. The public had moved on. Amanda hadn't. In the months that followed, she began receiving letters. No return address, always typed, always signed with just a single initial. M. They weren't threats. They weren't confessions. They were riddles. Lines from lullabies she barely remembered from her crib. Recipes written in her mother's handwriting. Coordinates that led to nowhere. Each envelope a reminder that the story wasn't over. That someone was still out there watching, waiting. And each time Amanda thought about destroying them, she couldn't bring herself to. Because despite everything, some small part of her needed to know why. Not just why she had been chosen, but why her mother had let it happen. Had she been protecting her? Sacrificing her? Or had she truly become the architect of everything Amanda had been running from? One evening, as the girls slept upstairs and the wind whispered through the trees outside, Amanda sat on the back porch with a single letter in hand. This one was different. It wasn't typed. It was handwritten, shaky but familiar, and it simply read, "You saw the villain, but you haven't met the survivor." Below it, an address in upstate New York. No city. No zip code. Just a house number and a road that didn't show up on Google Maps. Amanda folded the letter slowly, pressing it to her chest. She didn't know if she'd ever go. Maybe the answers would stay locked away in that hidden house, lost to time and fear. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like a pawn. She didn't feel helpless. She felt awake. And as she stood in the darkness of her porch, looking out at the night sky that had once guided her to a lie, she realized something far more unsettling than any conspiracy, any experiment, any betrayal. The truth was never just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been told what to remember, what to forget, and what not to question. Project Hadley had been exposed, but its echoes were everywhere, in the systems people trusted, the institutions they never thought to doubt. Amanda had broken the machine, but the blueprint still existed. And somewhere, someone was so as the screen fades to black, and the last words echo across the mind of every viewer. How many of your memories are really yours? You're left wondering. If Amanda could be rewritten, could you? Edie building it again.